Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So, Engagers, welcome once again. We have another rock star, or at least he used to be a rock star in gamification, and we might get into that with Mario. But Mario, before we get started, before we delve right in, are you prepared to engage?
Oh, yeah.
Let's do this, because Mario has been living in Silicon Valley since 2001 and researching technology trends, writing books and consulting companies in topics like innovation, Silicon Valley mindset, Foresight Mindset, Automotive, artificial intelligence, creativity, Intrapreneurship, and he worked for many years as a SAP development manager and innovation strategist. He is now helping companies apply the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit from Silicon Valley into their organizations to be, more innovative, discover trends and tipping points earlier to influence them as well. He's given, keynotes about these topics, conducted workshops on Foresight Mindset, artificial intelligence, innovation, Silicon Valley mindset, all these things that we mentioned before. And he's also looking for signals of emerging technology trends and how they impact society, politics, or employment. So, Mario, is there anything that we're missing from that intro?
No, that's already way too long, that intro.
Fantastic. So, Mario, you're now living in Silicon Valley. I understand you're originally from Austria. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was born in Austria, in Vienna, from the capital, the musical capital, so to speak, and born to a family that was basically really hardcore Viennese, multiple generations. And I studied chemical engineering at the Technical University, and also have an MBA from the University of Economy in Vienna. And put that together, worked a lot on big data stuff, and then moved to SAP about 98. Worked in Germany at the headquarters. SAP is this large software company that back then nobody knew of, although they were already pretty large and pretty dominant. And then in 2001, right, 2 weeks after September 11 happened, I moved to the US, to Palo Alto, where we are really in the middle of the Silicon Valley. And the Silicon Valley is area from, depending on how you define it, but let's say it's from San Francisco down to San Jose, about 60 to 80 kilometers distance. And the Silicon Valley is also the birthplace, basically, of Atari. Atari was 30 years ago a super dominant company here, apparently where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak also programmed for them and worked for them. And there was a lot of, I think, LSD involved. And so it was apparently a great place to work, as far as I understood.
I hope it still is, and that's one of the reasons why you want to be there as well. So, Mario, in a day like today, we had a pre-chat and we talked a bit about coronavirus, but what are you doing nowadays? What's your, what's moving you nowadays? What does your regular days look like?
During the pandemic, where we have lockdown, I have the feeling I have more work, in the sense of I have more time to spend on my writing. So many of the listeners may know me from my book Enterprise Gamification, where I wrote about how to use gamification back then in the enterprise environment for employees, for clients, for partners. Not so much in a marketing or entertainment space or loyalty program space. I enjoy writing books, so it helps me to structure the knowledge that I'm working on, and lets me also see the gaps that I have so that I can research that. And often I find a lot of new stuff that I was not even aware that existed. So I'm writing a lot. Typically my day looks like in the morning is my writing thing. It takes me some time to get into the writing, into the flow, so to speak, into the Csikszentmihalyi flow kind of thing. But then I write about 2 to 3, 4 hours, depending on how good I am on the road. And then mostly the afternoon is spent on reading and doing other stuff, basically doing the routine stuff, sending emails, preparing stuff, slides, whatever's necessary. So this is during Corona, during a lockdown like this. During other times, I'm traveling a lot, giving a lot of talks, doing workshops. So I have more uninterrupted time to write books at the moment.
That is a perk, one of the few ones that we can have from a situation like this one. Mario, we always like to talk to our guests, and we will be getting into other things because we know you were very deep into gamification. You have a book on gamification, and now it's probably not your main dedication, or you're probably not even doing much in that sense, but we want to go back in history. We want to talk about a story, about a time when you were creating games or a gamified strategy, and, there was a first attempt at learning. It didn't go as well as you expected. Can you tell us that story? And of course, what can we learn from that, and reveal as many names as you can, and, hide as many as you need as well?
So when I go back, and maybe even going back before the time of SAP, where basically I started then with gamification, where we started using this term like everywhere else in the industry. But I may be going back actually to the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s, and the most popular home computer was then the Commodore 64. Some of you may be way too young to remember that, but that was significant because it was the first, I think, home computer that sold millions that you could program. And it came with fantastic sound chips. So suddenly the music was a completely different level that we had there. And back then, I didn't have the money to really buy the software. It was super expensive for us. So we had all these pirate copy games. I think I spent all my allowance that I got for floppy disks. That basically was the storage medium where I stored this software. And I had like 2,000 games, I think. My brother was the one who was more motivated by playing Flight Simulator. Microsoft Flight Simulator, that you may still know today, was there already on a Commodore 64, because the basic system, the stuff had a basic emulator, was from Microsoft in the 80s. So that's how far the history goes back. I was not so much motivated by playing the games. In fact, I was not so much the player. I was more the collector. I had more the thrill in collecting the games. And you may have had 2,000 games. I think for the Commodore 64, in total, there were probably about 6,000 to 8,000 games programmed for that platform in its time. And it had a good run of like 6 or 7 years. Yeah. So I had 2,000 of those games. And of those 2,000 games, I played maybe on a regular base 10 or 20 of those games only. Yeah. So that's quite interesting to see that. So that was kind of the stuff. So we learned programming there. We taught it ourselves, autodidact, my brother and me. My brother's today a pilot. He's been flying. He's been a captain for Austrian Airlines, for the Austrian Airlines group now for 25 years.
Wow.
And I went into the software development. So during my PhD, I had to program a lot. And this is where the first time I basically used the gamification technique. What we did was we measured heating systems, so the emissions of heating systems, climate protection and as this stuff started already back then to have an impact. So we wanted to know in this study that was prepared for the Kyoto and Rio goals, climate goals, to figure out how much emissions are there actually really coming from our country for the different fossil fuels, from gas, oil, biomass and so. And my PhD was on measuring and calculating the emissions for carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfuric and soot and all this stuff for heating systems that were oil fired. One of the fuels actually was nothing else than diesel. and later on, I have at the moment a lot to do with the automotive industry, so I know how to manipulate that. Yeah. But we had these big forms back then in the 90s where I wanted the teams that were measuring that to fill out that form. And we had troubles, people filling out the forms correctly, and we did not have enough measurements. Yeah. So one day I started in the meeting room that we had to put up a number. The number was how many heating systems we had measured. And we were about 60, and we were far below the first milestone. And the boss of these people, he said, okay, if we reach 100, we're going to have pizza and beer and pretzels. And suddenly, just by putting up this number and everyone knowing suddenly where we are at, they started to, on the road, having ideas, talking to the people. And my neighbor has also a heating system, so you can go over there and measure it. My brother-in-law also has one. So suddenly, instead of having just 5 measurements, they brought 15 measurements back home because they all wanted to have pretzel and beer. So that was kind of my first. What became important with this during this work was also that behaviors. I had, in this 4 years of my PhD project, worked with this company, and the first 2 years were really good. Everything went smooth. We were on the same line, and then leadership changed, and new people came in, and suddenly it went downhill. And I did not know what was going on there, so I started to read books on odd behaviors. A book like Dealing with People You Can't Stand, or about dialectics. That means how you use words and phrases in order to basically ruin a person or basically beat a person verbally. Yeah. And when I then, so fast forward SAP, I worked as a software development manager, and an innovation manager. And about 2010, the iPad came out. So in April 2010, the iPad suddenly was here, and I had already an iPhone, and SAP back then, you have to remember that was full BlackBerries. So 18,000 BlackBerries in the company, but probably 60 iPhones. That's it. Yeah. And we started programming for that, and we had to defend ourselves against our managers and their managers. Why we're doing that for iPhones and not for BlackBerries? And so I was looking at what was happening with the top 10 apps that were in the App Store. And we looked at them, and we could not understand how they designed them that they were so compelling, yeah? and so great to use. And then, if you're familiar with SAP software, it's basically on the other side of the spectrum. It was very difficult to use, very complicated and difficult. And so a lot of people were frustrated with that. And we didn't want to see that experience happen again on an iPad and an iPhone. So we had to do something. And I was looking at and remember the colleague who had 5 years prior to that means in 2005, suggested for a hackathon that we had, shouldn't we do some like video games, look at that, and video games with business apps and so. And of course, back then, that was a stupid idea, of course. I don't remember that. Yeah? And I said, you know what, let's take a look at video games so we can learn from that. So I Googled video games and the business apps, and I found the term gamification. So when I looked for the term gamification in 2010, this was August, I got only 400 search results back then. And I wasn't even sure if this is the term that I was looking for. So I started an internal group. We had internal inside the company discussion groups. And so I started one that was called Video Game Development at SAP. And it quickly became clear that this gamification, what we're talking about. So I had within a year, like 700 colleagues worldwide.
Wow.
Jumping on that group, yeah, and trying to understand it. And we were working on identifying applications that use gamification design elements, yeah, like points or badge here or some fun element. And I basically had to also read up on game design and what are the game elements that they're using, and what motivates, what makes a game good. And I think this is still kind of a black box for a lot of game designers, that it's very difficult to design a good game. If you look at that, you have like 3 or 4 million apps on the App Store that are in the category games, and how many of them are really successful? Yeah, 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, and it's still a fraction of all the games that you have. So you see, it's kind of a dark art to get to a good game. And it's a bit easier for gamification because nobody expects from a business app or a non-game app to be entertaining. Yeah? So everyone is happy if it's a little bit entertaining. Yeah. So this group served basically that we educate ourselves, that we look at those things, and then you stumble over Amazon and the game design elements on Amazon. You look at LinkedIn. Yeah. You look at other scores and motivators to fill out the forms properly and come again. Facebook, Twitter, they all use these game design elements here and there, and you don't even notice that. And so we built up this knowledge and identified about 120 apps, business apps, applications, concepts, sometimes not realized, sometimes realized inside SAP that SAP had used. That means different departments, from marketing to Intel motivation, from HR to, software developers that built the iPhone app, where they had used game design elements. And then it became clear this is something that's not just an outlier or some odd thing. And we knew, we need to get more structured on that, educated on that. And that's how we came into that kind of thing. Now, that brings me back to the books from the 90s that I started on behaviors. Once I started to work on my book, I thought there are books on loyalty programs, there are books on entertainment, but they're all oriented towards companies, towards a client, to keep them loyal, like the airline loyalty programs, the supermarket loyalty programs, or a TV station, a channel, a series that a show that tries to keep their customers engaged and watch that show. But we were looking at how can I make it more fun for an employee who has to enter data in the system, who has to interact with our software. So, and nothing was out there. So I started to write on that book and look at what was published before. The first gamification books had come out. Jane McGonigal, Reality is Broken, although she didn't label that as gamification. And then Gabe Zicherman.
She didn't even like it too much to be.
She didn't even like it too much.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I saw her the first time in San Francisco at the first gamification conference that Gabe Zicherman had organized. And so I invited her, actually. She spoke then she was the first woman to speak at the SAP the tech conference as a keynote speaker. So I'm very proud of that to have her there. But when I looked at that, I had the feeling that something is not right, that this is not what we were talking about is not covering the right motivations, is not covering the thing correctly. Just put a badge here and it works, and put a point. No, this seems too simplistic, and it also dies pretty quickly in my experience and what I saw.
And Mario, let me just jump in for a second, because I'm hearing you, and I think we're heading into something like, what do you think makes good gamification and how does it make it work? So I wanted to ask you a question related to that. And it's, if you were, I know again that you're not necessarily doing this right now, but when you were doing these projects, did you have some sort of process, some series of steps? Like, how would you approach a project where you wanted to use gamification? Did you have a framework, a mindset? Like, how did you do that?
Yeah, it's more I call it the gamification design thinking. So I live here in a world where design thinking, some of you may have heard about that, was invented and is now used all over the world. IDEO, the design company based in Palo Alto, invented that. And then Hasso Plattner, the SAP founder, he brought it into SAP and his schools that he had funded. So he had the Hasso Plattner Institute in Potsdam, starting with design thinking. And then he founded at Stanford University, paid for the Hasso Plattner Institute, which is basically the academic program on design thinking. And design thinking, in this sense, is a way to approach a problem. So the Kelly brothers, who said that Tom Kelly in a video, he said, we don't know anything about the products that we're building, like a toothbrush or a space shuttle cockpit. We have no idea about that, but we know about the process. And so as a gamification designer, you don't know anything about process, the app, the business app that's there, but you know the process. So that means you're starting from a hypothesis that says, kids want toothbrushes. And and kids are just something like smaller adults. That's a hypothesis. But instead of starting to build the toothbrush or build now the business app or the gamified business app, you're actually going out in the field and looking into the bathrooms of the kids and watch them brush their teeth. And then you realize, well, there's a very different problem. Kids have not the fine motoric, the dexterity of their hands, for example, to hold a small brush. They're basically clasping the brush. So you need to actually make the handle of a toothbrush thicker than for an adult, because that's how they can hold it. Yeah. In the same, when you go out with gamification design, you think, oh, people just need some points and badges, and then they're filling out all the forms. No, you have to first look at their work situation. Why are they not, for example, filling out the forms properly? Why they are missing information? And then you sit at a table and then you see that they have to handle 7 systems to maybe help a customer on the phone. Yeah. And just copying the data from one system to the next cannot be improved by putting a point system on it. Yeah. Or making a funny icon on it. Yeah, there are underlying problems that you have to solve first. So a shitty system is not becoming better if you just put points and badges on there. You have to fix the shitty system and then can put points and badges. So this I call it the gamification design system to go on it. But that's just one component, because you need to also understand who your players are. And for me, it was always important to distinguish between user and player. Yeah. Because if you call it a user, you're chickening out of some important component. When you call the player a player, you always keep in mind that it has to be fun what you're building for the player. Yeah? When you call it user, you forget the fun. Yeah? You are not thinking of the fun anymore.
And even the activeness, like a player is an active subject. It's the user is, it's receiving things.
Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, they always have the users in the center of the attention, but in the center of the attention, he's an obstacle. Yeah? He's always in the way of us working. Yeah? So when you look at it as a player, you still are looking always, is this fun? Is this still fun? If you make that, is it still fun? And then when you look at the player, what motivates them? Yeah. And as soon as you start looking at that, you're realizing a lot of the things that back then were state of the art, and maybe still are considered state of the art today, although these discussions have been going on for years, are actually catering only towards a certain type of motivation, namely the extrinsic motivations. You just reward people with gold, stars, and points and badges, but you never look at the intrinsic motivators. And I think this has been one of the big problems within the gamification industry, that the gamification industry had to struggle with. First, all the people who started in the gamification industry thought, just put some badges and points over there and then it works. Yeah. So there's a lot of these tool vendors that came out focused primarily on those things because they were the easiest to build, the easiest to understand. But these are also the ones that they bring at the beginning great results, but then fizzle out, yeah, and basically fail. And it's way more complicated Absolutely. To have something like intrinsic motivations, figuring that out, that thing, yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of customers or clients come from the perspective, oh, that looks so easy, that's easy, just points and badges, we can do that too, yeah. So they don't hire then a gamification designer, but do it themselves, and then it fizzles. And of course, its gamification doesn't work, yeah, because it's stopped, and so they give up. It's like if you have no driver's license and never drove a car and you hit a tree, it's not the car that doesn't work. Yeah, it's just you're a shitty driver. Yeah, and with gamification, it's the same. You need to understand that, and you cannot just do it and think you know everything. It's actually a very sophisticated process to keep that thing running. And it's not a project, you design it and then you start it and that's it. No, with the start of that gamified system, the whole process continues. Yeah, you have to make sure it's running properly, that people cannot cheat, that certain things that you identify can be used to emphasize that, and some have to be toned down. It's like a community. You're running a community here of gamers. So that's why it became important to look at the underlying behaviors, the motivators, and that's why I completely move over into behavioral science and behavioral economics, yeah, and this irrationality. And that is basically what I discovered then back then. Those were the books that I had started to read in the 90s, which kind of kept me fascinated. So when I looked then at my library, I figured out that I had already quite a number of books on odd behaviors and irrationality of people. And that was exactly what I needed in order to understand gamification better. And so I had to rewrite basically my entire book. It took me 2.5 years for that book to get it out there because of that thing.
It makes sense. It makes sense that you did it, exactly for what you wanted.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
So Mario, we would like to know, after you've been saying quite a few good things that we should do and things that we have to consider and keep in mind, is there something that you would say is sort of not a silver bullet, but maybe a best practice when you're thinking of a gamification project or you're analyzing something that somebody else did? Is there something that you could say, well, if you think about it this way, or if you do this kind of thing, it will definitely improve or help your project?
Well, I'm always of the opinion, do not make it a big bang kind of thing. Yeah, when you gamify, go in start with small things. Yeah, and improve over the time, and continuously look at that. I think many first timers, and I mean here companies that do gamification for the first time, may be tempted to do kind of an important system that they're gamifying, start big and roll it out, and then they run into all the problems because there are a number of elements that they're missing. Yeah, start with an app that's not bringing down the house. If it's not working, start smaller, but learn through that. So
starting small and learning from the experience.
Learn, improve, iterate, make it bigger. Get basically an in-house team that can learn, acquire the knowledge, acquire the skills. And once that thing is working, you will have interest from other groups, from other departments coming to you, asking you for how could we do something similar here? How would you do that? And then you have the skills in the house. Maybe you always will take, of course, some gamification design group, external vendor, especially with the platform then to help you work on that, to make it professional. But you need the inside skills as well, that the people understand a gamified system is a living beast. It's something that needs constant attention. It's like a community, a forum that you have. You wouldn't install an SAP system and then expect it to work without problems for the next 2 years. No, it has to be constantly paid attention. And then every so often, every 2 years, you do a larger refresh on that. Like you have, games like FIFA, World Cup. Every 2 years or 3 years, you have the next version of it where they add new functionality, new stuff. In between, you add just smaller things like new badges, new missions, things like that. You make minor changes that keep it fresh. But then every 2 years, you make a larger one. So that suddenly it becomes, again, really interesting for a lot of people who are tempted to now buy the new version again.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't matter what gamification design elements and tactics you're using. That is not so. It's really that you go out carefully. I was always more a proponent for that thing.
Absolutely. And Mario, after, hearing this interview, is there somebody that you think, thinking back of your gamification years, is there somebody that you would think I would really like to listen to this person in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
Oh, I'm not sure whom you already had, but I mean, back then, and I have to say first, I haven't done gamification now for the past 4 or 5 years. So I do not know who are now the newbies, the newcomers that pushed into that space, came here, are very highly motivated. So I know people, of course, that I have heard and seen all the time back then. Some that are very active, of course, Yukai Zhao with the Dalysis framework. Yeah, you have also Roman Rakwitz in Germany that have Marie.
Yeah, those are absolutely great. In this case, I understand that you haven't been.
Let me see one more name maybe.
Yeah, sure, please.
Marigo Raftopoulos, of course, from Australia.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because she comes really, really from the scientific side also, which is good.
Very useful, yeah, and she's great, especially as well. Also in
and then
conferences.
One is Sebastian Deterding, of course. Yeah. Ding
Oh,
Suite.
Sebastian. Yeah. We haven't had Sebastian. In fact, I think I tried to contact him a couple of years ago and something happened with our communication, but I dropped. I think we both dropped
So
the
those
line
are
there.
people that I definitely always would want to listen because they have some really great insights. Sebastian especially, he's very outspoken in the sense of he's very blunt, frank, or candid. He gives some very candid view on the gamification industry. So this is always what you want to hear. Yeah? And Marigo the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great recommendation. And is there, of course, right next to your books on gamification, is there another book that you would also recommend to the engagers, to this audience?
Well, I've written 17 books so far. I think this is my number. I have seven of them are the gamification books. They may be a little bit outdated now because they came out 2013, 2014. Wait a second, 2014, around 2015, in that time frame. Well, maybe to give you other books that I've seen, it's of course Actionable Gamification by Yukai Chao. One book that I always recommend is Punished by Rewards, Alfie Kohn, where he talks about the kind of extrinsic motivators of how they are wreaking havoc, especially in education systems. Yeah, one that I like was Top Dog, about competition. Yeah, many people in the gamification design space also confuse gamification with competition and think competition is super important. No, competition actually can be a full demotivator. And only 1 or 2% of the people that participate can win. So the book Top Dog is by Pope Bronson and Ashley Merriman is one that I always do recommend to get the notion of don't deal with that. Yeah, and then there are quite a number of smaller books that people have written that are not specifically necessary for gamification. There are some fresher ones, little ones to go quickly in if you're a newbie. Yeah? Toby Beresford had just one Infinite Gamification. But I generally would recommend looking also at books like Drive, Dan Pink, yeah, or Dan Ariely's book about irrationality. So or Daniel Kahneman, you may have heard about him, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Absolutely, yeah.
And once you are going into that space and have these books, you realize you're getting so much new materials and insights. Yeah, Richard Thaler is one on the Nobel Award winner for economics on behavioral economics. He basically started that field. That's the same that Daniel Kahneman is working on, or Dan Ariely. Yeah. So these are interesting areas to understand better motivation and extrinsic motivators and how they backfire. And then, of course, I think it always makes sense also to look into game design books.
Absolutely. Many great game design and gamification books. You have a full list of recommendations there, of course, right next to your books, Mario, which are great as well. And we've gone through recommendations, and I have one final request on the side of recommendations. And you mentioned that you've been playing since the Commodore 64 and collecting especially since then. So what would you say is your favorite game?
So actually, I played, when you look at video games, yeah, board games is a different story. It's also games, yeah. Video games started for us before the Commodore 64. We had Ticotronic. These were these Nintendo handheld games where you had Donkey Kong and these kind of things. I'm actually not really a gamer. So basically, my gaming time had stopped with Commodore 64. Also, I tried to look at Skyrim and such games, yeah, and World of Warcraft. But when I look back at one of the games that I liked was very, very simple. I can't remember what it was called. It is basically, you can play it and emulate it still on a Commodore 64 emulator, and it's a kind of a snake game. Yeah? So you have an empty field, and your snake runs, and what you have to do is to catch an area, to cover an area. And of course, there are interferences. There's kind of lines or dots that are flying around, and if they hit your line before you closed it off, making a field, you die. And the idea is you have to get to at least 50% of the area covered by your things. Yeah, and the more above 50 you are, the better, the higher the score. This is graphically a super simple game to make. Yeah, but it's extremely compelling, and that is maybe I can bring that in. A friend of mine is a game designer. He's my age, yeah, so really old. and he says when he hires people, game designers, he's asking them what games they're playing, and he becomes especially interested in people who name games that came out on Atari games and Commodore games back then in the 70s, 80s. Because the graphics was so simple, you couldn't really do much there. So as a programmer, you had a lot of time, or a relatively large part of the game programming was on the game design itself, on the game play.
Yeah, not on the theme, on the graphics,
not on the graphics. Yeah, exactly. So today, a lot of the games that you have, tons of resources are spent on the graphics and on the sound and this kind of things, but the gameplay sucks. And if you look at those games and you overlook the game graphics of those games, you realize these are really captivating games with a super simple graphics. So often today also, I mean, think of Flappy Bird. What was it called? Yeah. Flappy Bird, yeah. I mean, that was suddenly the absolute hit game because it was so difficult and it didn't, put honey on your lips. It made it super difficult, and the graphics was shit, and that just shot through the roof. Yeah, and the good, and even I would say Angry Birds. The success of Angry Bird is that the gameplay was just fantastic. There was no game story. The game story came later. Yeah. I mean, the pig stole eggs. Yeah, so what? Yeah, and the birds have no other means to basically get the eggs back by killing themselves, by throwing themselves and exploding at pigs. Yeah, but that's fun. I mean, I go with that story anytime. Yeah, instead of having these elaborate stories and then it's just a shooting game. Yeah, I mean, shooting games are great too. Yeah, but Elite, was one of those games that was a vector graphics game. That's still one of these games today which have endless universes. Yeah. So, but you can hear maybe I'm looking at the gameplay, and that is where the gameplay factor is much higher than the graphics factor. But that's compelling. That's a good
absolutely. And Mario, we were basically out of time, but I don't want to let you go before we have a quick chat about why you're no longer, in the gamification field. You are actually a massive expert in the area. Saying that the book is outdated is like saying that flow is outdated. It's a great book, and some things can just turn into classics with time because they've been thought through and all these things. But is there, what were the reasons? Can you talk us very quickly about like why you're no longer in the industry?
Yeah. So I think what I discovered is when I had customers coming to me and wanted to do gamification, I realized looking at the issues that it was not so much about gamification. It was they thought gamification is fixing problems that they have, but the underlying problems were in completely different areas. It was about engagement. It was about innovation problems that they had. It was a generally behavioral problem or cultural problem or other places, innovation problems that they had. And they thought gamification is a band-aid that I put it over there and it fix it, but you had to do surgery. And because I had done innovation a lot at SAP, I was always in innovation groups. I was always in the forefront of new technologies. I got more and more in touch with those innovation managers and those kind of people. And those are also driven a lot by behaviors. So gamification became a much smaller part than of my work. And so I started to write about the mindset, the behaviors that people show. What is the difference between the Silicon Valley and Europe, for example, in mindset on innovation? Why are there all these companies such as Apple, Netflix, Uber, Tesla, Google here and not coming from Europe? Yeah. And so suddenly I became high in demand with that. And then I said, okay, I think that's where people are really interested. And so I less and less spent time on gamification and moved really much into that space. Yeah? And then focus on certain industries like automotive or technologies like artificial intelligence. And that's my focus today.
So Mario, we've gotten great advice. We've gotten many, many things out of you today. And we're very thankful to have you in an episode like this one on today. However, it's time that we say goodbye, at least for now. So we want to know if there's any place where we can find you in social media and still maybe even ask you a couple of gamification questions here and there. Can you let us know where we can find you? Anything else, of course, that you want to plug or let people know where to find you? It's the perfect place to do so.
Yeah, I'm very active on social media and have a multiple websites. So if you just Google Mario Herger, you find me, and also can get contact forms, and my email is out there. They're very simple. If you have gamification questions, first I would recommend read the book. I may have answered it already. So I have one book that may be of interest. It's called Enterprise Gamification, which goes from the basics really to a lot of elements. So if you are not familiar with that, just look it up. It's on Amazon, so it should be available everywhere. And if you still have questions, just feel free to ask me. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much once again for this time, for jumping at least for a little while back into the gamification wagon with all of us. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Mario. And I'd like to know if you have any questions that you'd like to ask future guests like him or her or any other guests that we have in the future. All you have to do is go to professorgame.com/question and ask your question. If it is selected, and I'm pretty confident that you'll get to it, it will come up in a future episode and you will get answered live in an episode. So before you go on to your next mission, have you subscribed using your favorite podcast app so that you can listen to the next episode of Professor Game? Well, I hope you do. See you there.